they're offering interpretation for refugees. Because to give people the opportunity to tell their story in their own language, I think is to give them dignity. Because sometimes, most times, it is by telling our stories in our own languages that we're able to truly map out the emotional contours of our stories. So I'd like to start by telling you a story about my parents. In 1967, my parents lived in Nsukka, a university town in southeastern Nigeria. My father had just returned from the US, where he got his PhD in statistics from Berkeley and was employed as a lecturer. It was a heady, hopeful time across the continent of Africa. Many countries were newly independent, free of the European dictatorship that was colonialism. And many Africans were eager to help build their countries. My parents had 2 small children, a house, a car, a cook, and a stable life, with social evenings spent with their friends at the university staff club. Then the Nigeria-Biafra War started. Only days later, my parents heard the sound of shelling and gunfire, so frightening, so close, that they had very little time to pack anything before they ran. They left almost all their belongings behind. They ended up in another town, a town already very crowded. Even the refugee camps were full. My father was desperate. He was worried about being out in the open because of the possibility of air raids. He knew a man from that town, a man called Emmanuel. Emmanuel lived in a cramped house that was full of people, members of his extended family, people whose homes the war had also snatched. My father knew that it would be very difficult for Emmanuel to accommodate them, very difficult to stretch what was already badly stretched. Still, my father knocked on Emmanuel's door. Emmanuel looked at my parents, holding on to their 2 small, scared daughters, their faces, and he said, "We will make room for you." I think often of that moment because I wonder if my parents would have survived the war had they not benefited from that act of kindness. For 3 years until 1970, my parents were refugees. But they were not just refugees. Nobody is ever just a refugee. Nobody is ever just a single thing. Nobody ever just has a single story. By the time I was born in 1977, my parents had picked up their lives. My father had become a full professor, and my mother an administrator who would become the first woman to head the university administration. And I'm immensely proud of her grit. When I was growing up on the campus of the University of Nigeria, it was a slow, small, and lovely place. A place of green hills, well-tended hedges, red dust, hibiscus flowers, mango trees, cashew trees, and a wonderful children's library. I was an early reader. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably closer to the truth. What I read as a very young child were British and American books. I was also an early writer. At the age of 6, I was writing multiple-page stories in pencil with crayon illustrations. And I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They ate apples and played in the snow. They drank ginger beer because the British characters in the books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. My characters also talked about the weather, like the characters in the books I read, even though I could not understand for the life of me what people actually said when they talked about the weather. In my world, the sun was always out, except for when it rained, and then the sun was out again. In my world, people were black and ate mangoes and did not have snow. But I was a child, and like all children, I was vulnerable in the face of a story. Because I had not seen myself reflected in books, I did not think that people like me could be in books. I loved those British and American books. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not consciously, actively know that little girls like me, little girls with skin the color of chocolate, could also exist in literature. Things changed when I discovered African writers. Because of writers like Kamaralai and Chinua Achebe, I slowly went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I began to write stories about people who looked like me and did things that I recognized. What that discovery did for me was that it saved me from having a single story of what books are. Writing is what gives my life meaning. I love the solitude of writing. I love the near mystical sense of creating characters who sometimes speak to me. I love the possibility of touching another human being with my work. I love spending a large amount of time in the spaces between the imaginary and the concrete. The British playwright Harold Pinter once said that when he was unable to write, it was like being separated from himself. And I could not agree more. All of this is to say that stories formed me. I don't remember a time when I wasn't drawn to stories, to reading them, writing them, finding them.